My parents said I was wasting my life and disowned me. Then they learned my indie game has 50 million players. My father deleted my Steam account while I watched. 3 years of game development vanished with 6 clicks on his laptop. He said I was 25 and still playing video games in his basement instead of getting a real job. My mother stood behind him nodding as he explained I had 1 week to move out and find actual employment or they'd change the locks. This wasn't a threat or an ultimatum. They meant it literally. I'd shown them my passion project that morning thinking they'd finally understand. I'd been working on an indie game called Echoes of Forgotten for 3 years, coding during nights and weekends while working retail. I'd quit my job 2 months earlier to finish development using my savings. The game was 98% complete, just needed final testing and release. I'd explained all this, showing them my development roadmap and early gameplay footage. My father had looked at the screen for exactly 30 seconds before asking how much money I'd made from this hobby. I said none yet because the game wasn't released. He asked how much I expected to make and I gave him realistic projections. Most indie games made nothing. A successful one might generate $50,000 to $100,000 total if you were lucky. He pulled up average salary data for software engineers and showed me I could be making $120,000 annually with benefits and a 401k instead of gambling on a video game that would probably earn nothing. When I tried explaining that game development was legitimate work, that this was my career path, not a hobby, he'd grabbed my laptop and demanded to see my financial situation. My bank account showed $400 remaining. My credit cards were maxed at $15,000 from buying development software and assets. I had no health insurance and my last paycheck was 2 months ago. He showed the screen to my mother and said this proved I was incapable of making adult decisions, that I destroyed my financial future chasing a fantasy. He said he'd enabled this behavior by letting me live at home rent-free, but that was ending immediately. My mother added that they'd sacrificed so much to put me through college for computer science, and I'd wasted it on games instead of getting a proper programming job. She said every parent at church asked what I was doing with my life, and she was embarrassed to admit I was unemployed making video games in their basement. My younger sister Nadia had graduated law school and was clerking for a judge. My brother Samir was finishing his residency in cardiology. I was the family failure who couldn't figure out how to be a functioning adult. My father gave me until the following Sunday to pack my belongings and leave. He said if I wanted to waste my life, that was my choice, but I wouldn't do it under his roof using his electricity and eating his food. When I asked where I was supposed to go with $400, he said that wasn't his problem anymore. I'd made my choices. Now I had to live with consequences. I asked about my game files, and he said he'd backed everything up to an external drive I could take with me, but he was deleting my Steam account and my developer accounts because he wanted me to understand this game nonsense was over, that I needed to face reality and get a real job like everyone else. I watched him log into my accounts and delete everything. My Steam library with 300 games, my developer portal where I'd been preparing the Echoes of Forgotten launch, my Reddit account where I'd been building a community, my Twitter where I'd been promoting development. 3 years of online presence gone in minutes. He said sometimes people needed hard boundaries to stop destructive behavior. This was his final attempt to save me from myself. I called my best friend Priya that night and she said I could crash on her couch temporarily. She lived in a tiny studio apartment across the city and worked as a junior developer at a startup. She understood the indie game world, having tried and failed to launch her own game 2 years earlier. She'd ended up taking the corporate job for stability but still coded passion projects nights and weekends. She picked me up Sunday evening and helped me load 2 duffel bags and my laptop into her car. My external drive with 3 years of game development files was tucked in my backpack. That drive was everything. My parents didn't come outside to say goodbye. My father had left an envelope on my bed containing $500 in cash and a note saying this was the last financial help I'd ever received from them, that I was an adult and adults supported themselves. The note ended by saying they loved me but couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore. When I started making responsible choices, they'd be open to reconnecting. Until then, I shouldn't contact them because it was too painful watching me fail. Priya's apartment was 400 square feet with barely enough room for her furniture. I slept on her couch and tried to figure out what came next. I had $900 total and $15,000 in credit card debt. My game was 98% complete, but I needed money for Steam's $100 publishing fee, plus costs for final assets and marketing. I applied to every entry-level programming job I could find but had no interview skills and a 3-year resume gap I couldn't explain well. Saying I'd been developing an indie game made hiring managers dismiss me as unfocused. After 2 weeks, I got a job at a call center making $13 an hour. The work was soul-crushing, but I needed income. I worked 40 hours a week and spent every other waking moment finishing my game. Priya let me use her electricity and Wi-Fi without charging rent. She'd buy groceries and we'd split meals. She believed in Echoes of Forgotten even though she'd warned me the odds of indie success were brutal. Most games launched to complete silence. No sales, no players, just crickets. But she said my game had something special. The gameplay was tight and the story was emotionally resonant. It deserved a chance. I finished development 3 months after moving in with Priya. The game was a narrative-driven puzzle adventure about memory loss and family trauma. Players controlled a character trying to recover lost memories by solving environmental puzzles that revealed traumatic family history. The mechanics were simple, but the story was raw. I'd poured every emotion from my own family situation into the protagonist's journey. The game asked whether some memories were better left forgotten or if truth mattered regardless of pain. I designed it to take 6 to 8 hours to complete with multiple endings based on player choices. The art style was minimalist, but evocative. The soundtrack was haunting music I'd licensed from independent composers. Everything about it felt personal and urgent. I paid the $100 Steam fee with money I should have used for rent. Priya covered me that month without complaint. I set the game price at $15 and launched with zero marketing budget. I posted about it on Reddit and Twitter from a new account. I sent keys to a few small streamers who covered indie games. Then I waited. The first week I sold 8 copies. Total revenue was $84 after Steam's cut. I felt sick watching the numbers barely move. This was the game I'd sacrificed everything for, and almost nobody cared. Priya tried to reassure me that indie games took time to find audiences, that word of mouth was everything. But I couldn't shake the feeling my parents had been right. I'd destroyed my life chasing a fantasy that was clearly failing. Week 2, I sold 23 copies. Week 3 was 41 copies. Slow growth, but nothing that would sustain me financially. I was making maybe $300 monthly from the game while earning $2,000 from the call center. The math was brutal. Then in week 4, a mid-sized streamer named Kieran Wolf played Echoes of Forgotten on his channel. He had 50,000 subscribers and streamed narrative indie games. He loved my game completely, breaking down crying during the final act. His emotional reaction was genuine and his viewers noticed. The stream video got clipped and shared across social media. Comments praised the storytelling and said people needed to play this game immediately. Sales jumped overnight. I went from selling 200 copies total to selling 200 copies daily. Kieran's audience found the game and started spreading word themselves. Other streamers picked it up. Gaming subreddits featured it. Within 2 weeks, I'd sold 5,000 copies. Revenue hit $50,000 after Steam's cut. I stared at my bank account, unable to process the numbers. This was more than my parents said I'd make from the entire game lifetime. And sales were accelerating, not slowing. Gaming news sites started covering it, calling Echoes of Forgotten one of the year's most emotionally powerful indie experiences. They compared it to games like What Remains of Edith Finch and Grizz. Major streamers with millions of subscribers played it. Each one brought thousands of new players. By month 3, I'd sold 100,000 copies and earned $1 million. The number felt impossible. I paid off my credit card debt. I paid Priya back for everything plus interest she refused to accept. I moved into my own apartment. I quit the call center job. This was real. My game had found an audience. 6 months after launch, Echoes of Forgotten had sold 500,000 copies. Revenue exceeded $5 million after Steam's cut and taxes. Gaming publications were naming it one of the decade's best indie games. It won awards for narrative design and emotional impact. I hired a small team to help with updates and technical support. We added new language translations, expanding the international audience. Player count climbed past 2 million. The game had genuine cultural impact, with people discussing its themes in think pieces and video essays. Mental health advocates praised how it portrayed family trauma. Gaming communities analyzed its mechanics and storytelling techniques. Universities used it in game design courses. Everything my parents said wouldn't happen was happening. Everything they said was a waste of time had generated millions of dollars and touched millions of players. I wondered if they knew, if anyone had told them. My siblings had both blocked my number after I moved out per my parents' instructions. I'd been completely cut off from family for nearly a year. Then my mother called. Her number appeared on my phone on a Wednesday morning. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. She said hello with that specific tone she used when she was trying to sound casual, but actually wanted something. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine. She asked where I was living, and I gave her the vague answer that I had my own place now. She said that was good, that she was glad I'd figured things out. Then she got to the point. She said my cousin had mentioned seeing something about my game online, that apparently it had done quite well. She wanted to know if that was true. I confirmed Echoes of Forgotten had been successful. She asked how successful, with that same tone my father had used when demanding to see my finances. I told her the game had over 2 million players and had won multiple industry awards. She went quiet. Then she said that was wonderful, and she'd always known I had potential. That she and my father had been worried about my approach, but clearly it had worked out. She suggested we have dinner as a family to celebrate my success. She said everyone missed me and wanted to hear about the game industry. I asked why they'd want to hear about it now when they'd deleted my accounts and kicked me out for pursuing it. She said that was different. I'd been unemployed and directionless then. Now I was successful and they could see the value in what I'd accomplished. I told her I'd think about it and hung up. Priya asked if I was actually considering reconciling. I said I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me craved my parents' approval even after everything. Part of me was furious they only cared now that I'd proven profitable. My therapist, who I'd started seeing after the game launched, said I needed to process what I wanted from them. Did I want an apology? Recognition? Just to hear them admit they'd been wrong? Or did I want nothing because the relationship was too damaged? I spent a week thinking about it before texting my mother that I'd meet them for coffee. Just coffee. Not dinner at their house. Somewhere public and neutral. She agreed immediately, and we set a date for that Saturday. I met my parents at a Starbucks near their neighborhood. They arrived together looking older than I remembered. My mother hugged me and my father shook my hand formally. We sat down with overpriced coffees, and for a moment nobody spoke. Then my father asked about the game. He wanted to know the technical details, what engine I'd used, how I'd handled the development pipeline, what my profit margins were. He was treating this like a business meeting. I answered briefly, then asked why they'd wanted to meet. My mother said they'd been too harsh before, that they'd been worried about my financial security and maybe overreacted. My father added that they'd thought they were helping by forcing me to face reality. But clearly I'd found success, so their concerns had been unnecessary. Neither of them apologized. Neither acknowledged that deleting my accounts and throwing me out had been cruel and controlling. They framed it as a parenting strategy that hadn't been needed rather than an attack that had caused real harm. I asked directly if they were sorry. My father looked uncomfortable and said he regretted that things had gotten so adversarial. My mother said she wished we'd communicated better. These weren't apologies. These were deflections. I told them what they'd done had devastated me, that I'd been homeless sleeping on a friend's couch working at a call center while finishing the game, that their rejection had broken something between us that money and success couldn't automatically fix. My mother reached across the table trying to take my hand. She said families had disagreements, but blood was blood, that they wanted to be part of my life now that I'd proven I could be successful. The phrase, "now that I'd proven," made my stomach turn. I pulled my hand away. I told them I'd proven myself to the only people who mattered, which was my players. That I didn't need their validation anymore because I'd built something meaningful without them. My father's expression shifted. He said I was being immature and emotional, that they were trying to extend an olive branch and I was throwing it back in their faces. He said successful people didn't hold grudges. They moved forward. I stood up to leave. My mother asked where I was going, that we weren't finished talking. I said we were absolutely finished, that they'd made their choice when they kicked me out and I was making mine now by walking away. My father said if I left, I'd regret it, that I was burning bridges I'd need later. I told him I'd already survived losing them once and I'd survive it permanently. I walked out of that Starbucks and blocked both their numbers. Priya asked how it went and I told her they'd wanted to be part of my success without acknowledging the harm they'd caused. She said some people only saw value in others when those others became useful. That my parents had treated me as an investment that was failing and now wanted returns on investment they hadn't made. The next day, my brother Samir called from a number I didn't recognize. He said our parents were upset about the coffee meeting, that they'd only been trying to reconnect and I'd been hostile. I asked if he knew they'd deleted my accounts and kicked me out. He said he knew, but that was in the past. That I needed to let it go and accept they were proud of me now. I asked if he'd blocked my number because they told him to. He went quiet, then admitted yes. I told him we were done and hung up. A week later, my sister Nadia showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called up and I almost said not to let her up but decided to face this. She came to my apartment and I let her in but didn't offer her anything. She stood in my living room looking around at my furniture and gaming setup. She said she'd heard about the coffee meeting, that I'd been rude to our parents. I asked if she'd come to lecture me. She said she'd come to help me understand their perspective, that they'd been scared for me and made mistakes but they loved me. I asked if love included deleting my life's work and making me homeless. She said I was exaggerating, that I'd stayed with a friend and figured things out, that successful people overcame obstacles. I told her she had no idea what I'd been through, that she'd had their full support through law school while I'd fought for survival. She said that was because I'd made irresponsible choices while she'd made smart ones, that I'd gotten lucky with my game but could have easily failed. I told her to leave. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that our parents had raised us and sacrificed for us and I owed them respect. I opened my door and told her to get out. She left saying I'd regret treating family this way. The harassment escalated from there. My father started calling from different numbers. My mother sent letters to my apartment. They showed up at a gaming conference where I was speaking on an indie dev panel. Conference security had to escort them out when they tried approaching me backstage. They contacted gaming journalists asking them to write stories about how I'd abandoned my family after finding success. Most journalists ignored them, but one tabloid gaming site ran a hit piece questioning whether my family trauma game was exploitative, given that I'd apparently cut off my actual family. The article interviewed my parents, who painted themselves as confused and hurt by my rejection. They said they'd always supported my dreams and were devastated I'd turned my back on them. The piece went semi-viral in gaming circles, with people debating whether artists who made work about trauma owed their families privacy or explanation. Some people sided with my parents, saying I was profiting off family drama while refusing to reconcile. Others defended me, saying families didn't own their children's stories. The controversy was exhausting and invasive. My lawyer, whose name was Terrence Kemp, suggested we send a cease and desist letter. We documented everything from the account deletions to the conference stalking. The letter demanded they stop contacting me directly and stop making public statements about our relationship. It warned that continued harassment would result in a restraining order. My father's response came through his own lawyer. His letter claimed I was alienating myself from family for publicity, that my game's success had gone to my head and I'd become cruel and ungrateful, that they'd only tried to reconnect out of love. His lawyer suggested we enter family mediation to resolve our differences privately. Terrence advised against it, saying my parents were trying to control the narrative by forcing me into a process where they'd have leverage. He said restraining orders were more appropriate given the stalking behavior. I agreed and we filed. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. My parents hired an expensive family law attorney who argued in court that this was a family disagreement being blown out of proportion. That parents who'd raised me and paid for my education deserved better than being legally barred from contact with their daughter. I testified about the account deletions and being made homeless. About my mother calling only after discovering my success. About them showing up at my conference. About the harassment through journalists. I presented text messages and emails showing their pattern of behavior. The judge asked my parents directly why they deleted my development accounts. My father said it had been to help me face reality. The judge asked if making me homeless had been intended to help me. My mother said they'd given me money and a week's notice, which was reasonable. The judge reviewed everything with growing concern. She said parents who destroyed their adult child's work and made them homeless couldn't claim their later reconciliation attempts were motivated by pure love. That showing up only after financial success suggested ulterior motives. She granted a temporary restraining order requiring them to stay 500 feet away from me and my workplace. She scheduled a hearing for a permanent order in 30 days. My parents looked shocked. Their lawyer tried to argue, but the judge said the evidence of harassment was clear. As we left the courthouse, my mother tried to approach me, and bailiffs had to intervene, reminding her the order was active immediately. Gaming news sites covered the restraining order because my parents' lawyer had made the mistake of talking to press about it. The story became about controlling parents who'd sabotaged their daughter's game development, then tried to reconnect when she succeeded anyway. Public opinion shifted heavily in my favor. Other indie devs started sharing their own stories about unsupportive families. A movement emerged around validating creative career paths and rejecting parental control. My game sales increased again from the publicity. Player count passed 5 million. Revenue exceeded $30 million total. I'd become one of the most financially successful solo indie devs ever. The contrast between my parents' predictions and reality was stark. They'd said I'd make nothing, and I'd made millions. They'd said I'd fail, and I'd succeeded beyond industry standards. Everything they'd been certain about had been catastrophically wrong. A month later, at the permanent restraining order hearing, my parents brought character witnesses. My siblings both testified that I was vindictive and had always been dramatic. Several family friends said I'd been a difficult child who refused guidance. My parents' lawyer presented this as evidence I was unstable and using legal systems to punish them for normal parenting. Terrence countered with testimony from Priya about finding me homeless. From Kieran the streamer about how my game's authentic emotion clearly came from lived trauma. From my therapist about the psychological impact of parental rejection. From conference organizers about the security incident. The judge listened to everything carefully. When my parents' lawyer finished, she asked my father directly what he'd expected would happen when he deleted my accounts. He said he'd expected me to grow up and get a real job. She asked what he considered a real job. He said corporate employment with benefits and stability. She pointed out I now ran a successful game development company with employees and millions in revenue. That seemed quite real. He said he meant a traditional career path. The judge's expression hardened. She said parents who couldn't accept their adult children's choices and responded by destroying their work had forfeited the right to later claim concerned parenting. She made the restraining order permanent for 5 years with possibility of renewal. She said if they violated it, they'd face criminal charges. My parents left looking furious and humiliated. I felt relief and something resembling closure. The gaming industry embraced me after that. I was invited to speak at major conferences about indie development and overcoming adversity. My story became motivational for other devs dealing with unsupportive families. I started a grant program funding indie devs from difficult backgrounds. The grants covered living expenses during development so people didn't have to choose between survival and creation. I funded 20 devs in the first year. Several of their games went on to find success. I wanted to help others avoid the desperation I'd felt. Echoes of Forgotten continued selling steadily. Player count reached 10 million. I released a free update adding new story content exploring themes of found family and chosen support systems. Players loved it. Critics praised how I'd evolved the game's themes. 2 years after launch, a major studio approached about adapting the game into a streaming series. The offer was substantial, and they wanted me involved creatively. I negotiated a deal where I'd executive produce and have script approval. The show was greenlit for 8 episodes. This was beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I'd been coding in my parents' basement. I bought a house. Nothing huge, but mine completely. 3 bedrooms with a dedicated office for game development. I hired a small team and started working on my second game. This one was about rebuilding after trauma, about learning to trust again after betrayal. The mechanics involved repairing a fractured world piece by piece through puzzle solving. I poured 3 years into it. During development, I heard through distant relatives that my father's business was struggling. He owned a commercial real estate firm that had made bad investments. The family money was declining. My mother had to take a job for the first time in 30 years. My siblings were both doing well professionally but weren't in positions to bail out our parents financially. I felt no satisfaction from this, just distant acknowledgement that financial security wasn't as permanent as they'd believed. My second game launched to strong reviews and solid sales. It didn't reach Echoes of Forgotten's level, but it didn't need to. It was profitable and meaningful. I'd proven my first game wasn't a fluke. 5 years after the restraining order was issued, my parents' lawyer contacted Terrence asking about modification. They wanted permission to attend my sister's wedding where I'd be present. Terrence consulted me and I said no. If they wanted modification, they could petition the court, but I wouldn't voluntarily suspend the order for one event. The wedding happened without them attending. Nadia was furious with me. She sent a long email about how I'd ruined her wedding by forcing our parents to miss it. I responded that I'd done no such thing. They'd ruined their relationship with me through their own choices and were now facing consequences. That if she wanted someone to blame, she should blame them for the harm they'd caused that had made legal protection necessary. She didn't respond. The wedding was beautiful despite the drama. I gave a brief speech about chosen family and supporting people through their journeys. Several guests told me afterward they'd been following my career and were impressed by what I'd built. 10 years after being disowned, I was invited to give the keynote at the Game Developers Conference. This was the industry's premier event. The keynote slot was reserved for legends and pioneers. Being asked felt surreal. My talk was titled Development Through Darkness, Creating When the World Says No. I spoke about unsupportive families, financial desperation, self-doubt, and the importance of finding your people. The audience was 15,000 developers. The response was overwhelming. Standing ovation. Multiple sessions afterward had people sharing their own stories of parental rejection and creative perseverance. After my talk, a reporter asked if I'd reconciled with my family. I said no, and didn't plan to. She asked if I regretted that. I said I regretted what they'd done, but not the boundaries I'd set. She asked if success had validated my choices. I said success was wonderful, but validation had come from my players and the community I'd built. That I'd learned early that waiting for parental approval was pointless. Real validation came from people who actually saw and valued you. The interview ran in several gaming publications. My parents apparently saw it because Terrence received another modification request. This time, they wanted the restraining order dropped entirely. They claimed 10 years was enough time and they'd like to establish contact. Terrence filed an opposition brief. We argued their pattern of only reaching out when I was successful suggested ongoing opportunistic behavior rather than genuine remorse. We noted they'd never actually apologized for the specific harms they'd caused. The judge reviewed everything and denied the modification. She said the absence of apology or accountability suggested the relationship dynamics that necessitated the order hadn't changed. My parents had one more legal option, which they took. They filed a civil suit claiming I'd defamed them through public statements about our estrangement. They sought damages for reputational harm and emotional distress. The lawsuit was absurd but expensive to defend. Terrence brought in a First Amendment specialist named Diana Ochoa. She explained that truth was an absolute defense to defamation. We had documentation of everything I'd said publicly. The deleted accounts were documented. The homelessness was documented through Priya's testimony. The conference stalking was documented by security. We filed a motion to dismiss, arguing every statement I'd made was provably true. The judge agreed and dismissed the suit with prejudice, awarding me attorney fees. My parents had to pay $45,000 for my legal defense. Their lawyer apparently advised against appealing. I heard through the family grapevine that this financial hit had worsened their already struggling finances, that they'd taken the suit on contingency expecting to win and now owed money they didn't have. I felt nothing about this. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just distance. These were people who'd tried to destroy me legally after failing to destroy me personally. They weren't family in any meaningful sense anymore. Echoes of Forgotten reached 50 million players in its 10th year. The number was staggering. 50 million people had experienced the story I'd created in my parents' basement. 50 million players had connected with themes about family trauma, memory, and healing. The game had been translated into 30 languages. It had won dozens of awards. Universities taught courses analyzing its narrative structure. It had become a cultural touchstone. The streaming adaptation premiered to strong viewership and critical acclaim. The show brought new players to the original game. Player count climbed past 60 million. Revenue over the game's lifetime exceeded $200 million after all cuts and expenses. I'd built a small game development studio with 15 employees. We'd released 3 successful games total. I'd established myself as a creative voice in the industry. None of this would have happened if I'd listened to my parents, if I'd gotten a corporate software job and buried my passion. Their rejection had been devastating, but it had also freed me from their expectations. I'd built something real because I'd had no choice but to prove them wrong. 15 years after being disowned, I was profiled by a major news magazine for a feature on creative entrepreneurs who'd overcome family rejection. The piece included interviews with my parents conducted without my knowledge or consent. They claimed they'd always supported my dreams but had worried about financial stability. They said they were proud of what I'd accomplished and wished we could reconcile. They said the estrangement had been painful, and they'd tried repeatedly to reach out, but I'd refused contact. The interviewer had done enough research to know this framing was misleading. The article included counterpoints noting the restraining order and the dismissed defamation suit. It presented my parents' claims skeptically, while letting them reveal their own self-serving narrative. The article generated enormous response. Thousands of readers shared their own stories about unsupportive families, about parents who'd only shown interest after success, about the complicated emotions of proving doubters wrong. My story had become bigger than just me. It represented something universal about parental control, creative validation, and the choice to build your own life when your family won't support it. I did one interview after the article ran. The interviewer asked if I'd ever forgive my parents. I said forgiveness implied they'd acknowledged wrongdoing and asked for it. They'd done neither. They'd rewritten history to make themselves supportive parents blindsided by their ungrateful daughter. I couldn't forgive people who wouldn't admit what they'd done. She asked if I was happy. I said yes, absolutely. I had work I loved, a team I valued, players who connected with my games, chosen family who'd supported me through everything, financial security I'd built myself. I didn't need my parents' approval or presence. I'd found everything worth having without them. The interview ended with me saying the best revenge was living well, and I'd done exactly that. 20 years after being disowned, I received word through my brother that my father had died. Heart attack at 73, sudden and unexpected. Samir's message was brief. He said I might want to know even though we weren't in contact, that the funeral would be private family only so I wouldn't be welcome. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Grief for what had never been, relief that he was gone, anger that he'd died without ever acknowledging what he'd done. I didn't attend the funeral, but I sent flowers with a card that said, "I hope you finally found peace." My mother called from my sister's phone after the service. Her voice was frail and older. She said she was alone now, that Nadia and Samir were busy with their own families, that she'd always hoped we'd reconcile before it was too late, that she regretted how things had ended between us. I asked if she regretted deleting my accounts and making me homeless. She said that wasn't fair to bring up after all these years, that she'd been trying to help me in the way she'd thought best. I said that wasn't an answer. She said she couldn't change the past. I said no, but she could acknowledge it honestly. She went quiet. Then she said she had to go, that she'd hoped I'd be different after all this time. I hung up and felt finality. My father was dead. My mother was incapable of accountability. The family I'd been born into was truly finished. But the family I'd built was thriving. Priya was still my closest friend after 2 decades. She'd left corporate development and joined my studio as lead programmer. Kieran, the streamer who'd first championed my game, had become a genuine friend and collaborator. We'd worked together on charity streams raising money for indie dev grants. My studio team felt like actual family. We celebrated each other's wins and supported through failures. I'd mentored dozens of young devs who'd gone on to create their own successful games. I'd built a community of people who understood that creativity and commerce weren't opposites, that you could make meaningful art and also sustain yourself financially. That rejecting toxic family wasn't failure, it was self-preservation. My parents had been wrong about everything. My game wasn't worthless. My career wasn't a waste. My life wasn't a disaster. I'd built something meaningful and successful entirely without their support. 50 million players had experienced the story I'd created. That number represented 50 million people who'd connected with themes about trauma and healing and choosing your own path. Every player was vindication. Every dollar earned was proof. Every award won was validation. Not from my parents who'd never understood, but from the people who actually mattered. I'd learned early that some people couldn't see value in anything outside their narrow worldview. My parents had been those people, and I'd thrived without them. That was the real success. Not the money or the player count, but the fact that I'd built a life I loved despite their certainty I'd fail. They'd said I was wasting my life, and they'd died never understanding how completely wrong they'd been. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.